we are going to be hearing next from our friend Marlowe, who is going to be giving us a little introduction on animation. So please, digital round of applause.
Hello everybody, my name is Marlowe Dobbe. You may know me as an organizer for the Portland Indie Game Squad, but during my day job, I am an artist and animator for video games. So buckle up, because today I'm going to be giving a talk going over the basics of animation. So first, why the basics? No matter what type of animation you're interested in doing, be it 2D, 3D, cartoons, realism, etc., you can benefit from knowing and practicing these basics. Real life moves at and I wrote a number down here, but I'm just going to say a bajillion frames per second, and our animations tend to cap out at around 60 frames per second. Since we are trying to fool the brain into thinking we are seeing real movement when we're animating, there are a lot of tricks we can use to make lower than life frame rates look like realistic and natural movements. So the first principle, the first basic I'm going to go over here is actually called squash and stretch. Probably the most popular, you may have heard about it. Squash and stretch refers to the squishing, stretching, or otherwise reshaping the shape you are animating to emphasize its movement. So these two animations that you see on the right are the same size and number of frames, but you can see how the animation with squash and stretch has more movement and personality. So basically all I've done here with the animation is taken the ball, and when it hits that impact of the ground, it's like kind of squishing and stretching out, and when it jumps up, it's kind of stretching a little bit more vertically to look like it's kind of moving a little bit faster. And you can really see the difference. They're both moving at the same speed and in the same place, but you really get a much better sense of the movement and where the ground plane is and all of that kind of stuff. So it's cartoony, but it is really helping kind of communicate what's going on with this movement. And here's sort of a frame by frame breakdown of what that ball looks like. So kind of going from left to right here, you see it starts at the top a little bit slow, and then they've got that long kind of smear frame in the middle where it's really tall and looks like it's moving really fast. And then when it hits the ground, it just continues to kind of squish and stretch out with that impact. And then it will bounce back up and just repeat the animation. Much more interesting than just looking at a bunch of circles in a line. Cool. And then the next basic is called anticipation. So anticipation is the movement before the main movement. Think about how you angle your bat back a bit before swinging it forward to hit a baseball, or how a cartoon character leans back and lifts their leg up really high before breaking out in a run. So anticipation helps the viewers read movement a little bit better. And again, I have an example at the top here with anticipation and without. You can see that before the ball kind of moves all the way across, it kind of goes backwards a little bit, so in the opposite direction of the main movement. And that's just kind of like a good wind up that helps you really read the animation and where it's moving. Similarly, I have the frames broken out here, and this one goes from top to bottom. So you can see I drew little arrows around, but the first, 5 frames have the ball just going back a little bit. It doesn't move very much. And then it does that huge motion forward where that big arrow is. And then it kind of slows down at the end with another 4 frames just to slow that movement down a little bit. The next basic is called follow through. So where anticipation is the movement before, follow through is actually the movement after. Follow through refers to the remaining movement in an animation after the main movement. So with this one, think about how long hair kind of continues to move on the head after it's turned, or how a cat's tail is like the last thing to stop moving after a cat sits down. Those are sort of things that you would want to animate follow through with. It's movement after the main movement. So with the examples below, notice how the stem of the ball continues to move after the main animation of the ball moving is complete. So the follow through is making that movement feel a little bit more realistic and a little bit more fluid. Things aren't all just moving at the same speed. Things are moving in the same direction, but they have different speeds at which they move and which they arrive at kind of the destination. And yeah, you can see it's kind of like a nice, really fluid movement here. And on the right, it's like super snappy and kind of looks a little bit unnatural, and it's a little harder to read what's going on with that. So I don't know why I put a stem on this little ball. Maybe it's a hand giving you a flower or a blade of grass or something, or it has a tail. Use your imagination. And then next, another basic to have in your back pocket is easing. So it's kind of similar to anticipation and follow through, but it just kind of happens in a different spot. Easing refers to easing in and out of the main movement of the animation, or rather adding more frames at the beginning and the end of the main movement to make the movement appear less harsh. So you'll see it's different in anticipation, where when the ball is about to move, it's not really moving back before it moves forward, but you can see that it takes a little bit longer to go into the main motion and a little bit longer to ease out of it than the example at the bottom that does not have any easing. And then next, I'm going to talk a little bit about loops. This isn't really like a basic principle of animation, but it's something that's really handy. In video games, generally you want to work in looping animations. So this means that the animation can be played indefinitely and look seamless. In other words, it loops perfectly. It does take practice, but it's worth making your loops look like one continuous movement rather than a motion that moves and then reverses. Polished loops can add a ton of visual benefit to your games. So loops are going to be things like kind of this example here, which is like an idle animation or a walk animation. Generally in games, things tend to loop more than they play just one time. So it's a good thing to practice. And here I have an example of this kind of paper doll puppet animation. It's actually very scary now that I look at it. It's kind of like Slender Man-y. But on the left, I have an example of like an animation that just plays and reverses. So you can see it just kind of like the body goes down and up, the arms move down and up, and you can tell where it's looping and where it's reversing. It's kind of just going to one point and then playing the animation backwards until it's back at the beginning. And on the left, this is more of a continuous movement. So there's not really any movement that is playing forward and reversing. Everything's just kind of moving very fluidly. I'm not really just like going to one spot and reversing it. I'm kind of playing with each of the different joints and making sure they feel a little bit more fluid. So you can see it's just a bit more of a natural movement, even though it's still a scary paper doll person. You can tell that it looks a lot more fluid and a lot more natural, and you can kind of get a lot more personality out of it if you work on those kind of things. So loops, make them natural, highly recommended. Put that little extra work in. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about frame rate. So this is a question I think that gets asked a lot by people who are kind of just starting out with animation, is what frame rate do I animate at? And the answer is kind of up to you. More frames does not necessarily mean better animation. It will kind of just mean more fluid animation. Because our brains are wired to watch films, people are generally accustomed to watching motion at as low as 10 frames per second and not really find them jarring. I've got some examples here. I'm betraying how much anime I watch, but on the top I have two examples from Studio Trigger properties where on the left you can see there's like 2 to 3 frames of animation happening like per second with this animation. And on the right is Premiere, which has a lot of moments in that movie where they kind of get away with really low frame rate by drawing really dynamic poses, and you can really follow the action by just following the poses. It's a really good stylistic choice, and they pull it off really well. And in the bottom, I have 2 examples from the Castle of Cagliostro, the loop on the third movie. And you can see on the left, it's like a really exciting, like really well animated car chase scene. But when you slow it down, like this humongous action is only 3 different drawings. And on the right, even like it's a bit more fluid of emotion, but it's still pretty low frame rate, but you really can understand what's happening there. And I should also say I'm using a lot of just 2D examples in this talk, but all of this applies to 3D as well. So when you're choosing your frame rate, yeah, it's kind of up to you. It can be a stylistic choice. You can, be working in 3D, and it's a lot easier to export things at 60 frames per second than it is to necessarily draw 60 drawings by hand to fill 1 second of animation. If you're doing 2D animation and you choose to do 60 frames per second, God help you. I tend to work at 10 frames per second when I animate in 2D. But yeah, it's kind of up to you. You can do whatever you want with that as long as it feels expressive and you feel like you can get what you want across. So I'm going to kind of go through a really quick process of just like how I would break out and draw a really simple animation. So the first step is to draw what is called like a timeline. It's a little bit different than like what they call the timeline in a software if you're using some sort of software to draw. But a timeline is a handy tool for starting an animation. So you'll basically draw a line in the direction of your movement that you want. Then you're going to draw lots of little dots or notches wherever you want a frame to appear. So it's kind of like a guideline. It's like a rough sketch. And remember, the more space between frames, the more movement is perceived / the faster the movement appears. So more frames means slower, subtler motion. We saw that with the easing example. And less frames further apart means a lot faster and a lot more motion. So here I've drawn a curve and I put notches where I want the frames to occur. I've done a little bit of a mix of a lot of little frames together and then some that are pretty far apart so we can see the difference. And then the next step that you're going to want to do is called keyframing. So once you have your timeline roughed out, you're going to start with the most basic frames, usually something like the beginning, middle, and end, or just sort of whenever, a character's pose really changes or some sort of important motion happens. These basics are called keyframes. They are key movements of the animation. So with keyframes, you should be able to tell with these few frames what the general motion of the animation will be. So it will look really choppy if I just played 4 frames. But by looking at these 4 frames, I can understand where the beginning of the animation is, where the end is, and a little bit of what happens in the middle, and sort of where that long kind of smear frame is going to end up being. And then when you have your keyframes finalized, it's then time to draw all the frames in between those. So these frames are commonly referred to as tweens. Tweens fill in the gaps, show the more subtle movement that happened between the keyframes, and then you pretty much just keep tweening till your animation is complete. So what I would do is I would look at my first 2 keyframes, I would draw the frame in between those, and then I would kind of like do it in halves and like draw the frame in between 2 other frames and the frame in between 2 other frames until essentially I've drawn every frame in the animation. You just keep on tweening. Sometimes actually, I should mention that in the animation industry, there are people whose jobs it is to just draw tweens, and there's also people whose jobs it is to just draw keyframes. But here we're doing both of them at the same time because we're doing a simple animation. And so here's a little example of what that animation looks like after I've finished my timeline and done my keyframes and done all my tweens. And you can see at the beginning and end where I had sort of more notches, the movement is a little bit slower. And in the middle where there was less notches, you can see the ball moves really, really fast. But you can kind of tell that line that I drew, and it's really following that line of motion. So yeah, that's pretty much how you animate. So just to kind of wrap things up, I'm going to say add basics to taste. This is probably my favorite slide because I love these 2 GIFs next to each other. Remember, you don't have to over-exaggerate your movements or make them look really cartoony to use these principles. Even subtle animations can make more realistic animations shine. Subtle applications can make more realistic animations shine. Choose what's right for you. You don't need to use all of these in one animation. Like, you don't need to look at your animation and say, I need easing, I need anticipation, I need squash and stretch. Like, just try out different combos together, see what you like. They're all tools in your toolbox that you can use at any time. And you can see like there's clearly a lot of squashing and stretching happening in this Tom and Jerry GIF at the top. And there is actually a little bit happening in this Kiki's Delivery Service GIF at the bottom. Like, you could see like the size of her pupils get larger. And yeah, there's just like really subtle ways to apply all these things that can really help your movement read. So to wrap things up, I've got a couple different tools. These are things that after I took one animation class, I kind of went to these websites and went through this list and practiced these, and I think it was just like super helpful. You can pretty much self-teach yourself by practicing these. So the top is 51 great animation exercises to master, and the bottom is 51 great animation loops to master. And those are both really important things to focus on and practice. And you'll find a lot of kind of like similar things to what I talked about in this conversation, in this talk, in these lists of things to practice. So I think the first one on both of them is like a ball that bounces and it has squash and stretch. And again, like you can do all of these practices in 3D too, if that's more your jam. All of these applications still apply. Now that you know them, you'll begin to notice them in like 3D movies you watch or 2D films you watch or anything like that. So yeah, I would definitely give those a shot. And I think that's going to do it for me. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I hope you all go forward and do some really fun, expressive animations. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Marlowe. Thanks so much, Marlowe.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much, Marlowe. Yeah, it looks like there's a lot of learning moments in there for people in the chat here. That's awesome. Yeah, there's so many different things you can do. Definitely check out that website that Marlowe mentioned at the end. Those techniques are super, super helpful to just practice, just doing it over and over again with simple shapes, with characters, anything like that. Think a lot about the kinds of things that you're animating. A lot of people have been talking about the Ghibli clip with the Kiki's delivery service, or the classic Ghibli expanding hair or expanding character when surprised or alarmed or intrigued or anything like that. I've seen there's a lot of examples on that website where it shows you, something moving in a specific way, and you can apply it to hair, or you can apply it to holding a piece of clothes, or any of those kinds of things is a great way of thinking about how you can apply these things yourself. Also, I really loved Marlowe's point here about thinking about those different layers of animation that you can apply to any specific thing, and how you don't necessarily have to apply all of them. I think that's a very relevant thing to Tyler's talk from earlier about when you're designing characters. There's a lot of ways to surprise and make a character design very enjoyable for a player, but you don't have to use all of them at once. So yeah, I think there's a lot of really cool connected themes going on here. Thanks so much.